Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Nicole and I'm going to be sharing with you what I've been recently reading. And I have read basically what amounts to a whole bunch of speculative fiction this week and of all different types, which is interesting and not intentional. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I have three different books to talk to you about and I liked most of them. I'll put it that way. So I'll start with the first book, which is a book that I did really enjoy, and that is Lives of the Monster Dogs. This is a book that I read for a local sci-fi fantasy book club we're in, and it has a really bizarre premise to it, and I wasn't sure if I was going to enjoy this book or not, but it definitely seemed like it had some potential. While this book has been out since 1997, I have never heard of this book, and I guess I shouldn't be that surprised by it. I don't feel like I was ever really as much into science fiction or fantasy or speculative fiction as I am now, so I don't know that I would have ever looked for this book before. This book is set in New York City in sort of an unknown time, but it feels like it's maybe in the early 2000s. It's kind of hard to pick up even like context clues to figure that out, and I don't think it exactly says. But either way, it is set in New York City, and it is during a time period, or actually after a time period, where there has been a century of experiments being done on some biomechanical dogs out in the wilderness of Canada. And at the point we are in the book, this is after the dogs have already moved to New York City because the dogs can walk on just two legs with the help of a cane. They have hands and voice boxes so that they can talk, and a lot of other aspects, including their intelligence, has been scientifically and experimentally enhanced. They've had their own revolution, if you will. They are dressed in their 19th century Prussian military garb, and they are ready to have a different life and share their stories. And the book proceeds to share the lives of these dogs through a series of journal entries, newspaper articles, a first person narrative account of meeting them and exploring their lives. There's even a short opera in here, or part of an opera, that is shared. And all of this is to introduce us, the reader, to the lives of the monster dogs. This is definitely a work that explores the idea of science and technology and the ethics of science and scientific experiments. It explores a lot surrounding animal intelligence and cruelty and the limits of compassion. That one came directly from the back of the book. There were a lot of highs in reading this book, including the plot and the pacing. I really liked the sequence of events and the way the story was told, even though it bounced a little bit around from, the future to the near past to the far past. I didn't find it confusing in the way that that was done, and I thought the pacing of the book overall was pretty well done. I did enjoy the writing style. I really think this author is a really good clear writer. I should uncover her name so you can see it. It is Kirsten Bakis, is I believe how you say her last name. And yeah, I loved her writing style. I thought it was a really well told story. I felt like I was hearing a fascinating story. I liked the protagonist, or the main narrator's voice, if you will. My only complaint was there was a point where I started to feel like the book was too long, and it wasn't a part of the book that I feel like you normally get that experience in. It was really sort of the falling action of the story. Like, we had reached the climax, we weren't at the resolution, and I was wondering what the resolution of the book would be, and I feel like there was probably still 100 pages left, and it just felt a lot of falling action that wasn't really tying up loose ends. If you follow that whole Freytag's pyramid. And it's not that every book has to perfectly follow that. It's just more, it was clear that the author was looking to wrap up and resolve the story. And it felt like she was struggling to do so. Like, I felt the struggle, and the struggle was real. And I was on the struggle bus with her. And that wasn't necessarily the best experience, especially at the end of what otherwise felt like a really amazing book. And I don't want to say it ruined the end for me, but it was definitely that part of the book that kept it from being 5 stars. I ended up rating this book 4 stars, and I would recommend it. Anyone who likes speculative fiction and/or exploring the scientific themes of experimentation and ethics, I think would enjoy this story. If you like talking animals in your story, that kind of thing. I will say, while there's not a lot of graphic violence in this book, and they don't always go into details about things. In fact, I appreciate that there's a lot of points in this book where it says, I'll just leave it to your imagination, that there are accounts of animal cruelty in here. And so if that's something that you don't like to read about, even in fiction, or can't handle, you might want to look up more content warnings surrounding that. I personally don't like a lot of on-page graphic violence of any sort done to anyone, and I did not find the level of it in here to be too much for me personally. I think that this book felt similar to me in some ways to Frankenstein, not in terms of like atmosphericness, but just having to do with that idea of like monsters and who's calling who monsters and how does that impact our view of people. And it also had an interesting exploration of looking at like different cultures in some ways and how that can help or harm our understanding of one another and our relationships. So, really good book, really deep and kind of sad in tone, but I truly did enjoy this and I can't wait to discuss it with the rest of the book club. The next book I have to share is a work of literary or historical fiction, but I feel like also has a bit of speculative nature in it, in that we're speculating about how somebody else's life could have been or turned out, and that would be Havisham by Ronald Frame. This is a book that is inspired by Charles Dickens' Great Expectations, and we will definitely come back to that word inspired. Whether or not you have read Great Expectations, you should know that this book is about Catherine Havisham, who is the daughter, I would even say spoiled daughter in some ways, of a wealthy country brewer. It's set in the early 1900s. Don't think Victorian time period, think more like Jane Austen and Emma time period. And Catherine Havisham is of Great Expectation fame, if you will. She is a character that is prominently featured in this book. I mean, in that book, Great Expectations. And this book is supposed to be relating her backstory, her upbringing, her life and loves, and almost her coming of age story. In the book Great Expectations, if you haven't read that, it talks about how she is later in life. And so this is kind of filling in the gap, or at least that's the impression that you will get. This book does discuss a lot about wealth and class, it discusses relationships. There's a lot of discussion and thought surrounding innocence and misunderstanding, and even the naivety that happens in youth, and the limits on the roles of women during this time period. The highs in this book, I would say, surround the setting and just getting to take a closer look at the realities of class during this time period. It was something that I noticed in Great Expectations, that she was the daughter of a brewer. And I felt the tension in Great Expectations, that it seemed like she was acting of a higher class than she was. And this book gets a bit more into that, or at least tries to explain that. And then from there, I think it's a matter of how well that's actually done. And that's where the lows come in this book for me. For me, one of the biggest lows in this book had to do with the themes and the meanings. I felt like those themes lacked a lot of coherence and meaning. I felt like this book was also pretty boring at times and a struggle to get through. And I have to admit, if it wasn't for the fact that I was buddy reading this, I may have DNF'd this book. I didn't. I continued reading it and it didn't get better. So I would have been right if I had a DNF'd it. In fact, by the end of this book, I could say that like me and my buddy reader friend, we were more or less so hate reading the book. We did not enjoy it. It was not pleasant to read. I didn't like the writing style that this book was written in. I really thought there were a lot of like plot holes and things that didn't make sense. It's definitely an adaptation of what happens in Great Expectation, and there were significant changes made to the character and her storyline and backstory from that book, but in ways that didn't make sense or have a lot of meaning or reason behind them at times, other than the author Ronald Frame's seeming own desire to explore other things. I ended up giving this book 2 stars, and that makes it probably the second worst book I've read this year, and that feels about right. I was not expecting that. I went into this book really expecting to enjoy it quite a bit. I don't typically have problems with adaptations or retellings, and I can enjoy them quite a bit. This one, though, just failed in every single way for me, and I think that's really a shame. Let me think of a good way to say how I feel about this book. I feel like in Great Expectations, We don't get Catherine Havisham's background. I will say that she wasn't my favorite female character in Great Expectations, and this book did nothing to improve that. And I also don't think that this author did a great job of writing her character. There were just some choices that were made in her characterization that kind of forgave every man in the book and placed a lot of the blame on the woman. In fact, she really was still blaming herself at the end of the book for everything that happened to her, and it was just very bizarre, very awkward, and yeah, I didn't enjoy it. You might like this book better than I did if you tend to like more experimental writing style, if you really enjoy literary fiction, and if you just wanted a different experience and character than what you got in Great Expectations. And if you just want to just speculate on any version of any life that Catherine Havisham may have had, even if it in no way whatsoever lines up with what's in Great Expectation, then, have at it. This may give you some other ways of looking at her and her life and the people in that book. I, again, don't always feel like adaptations have to stick strictly to the given storyline, but at the end of this book, it does start to line up with Great Expectations, which just doesn't make sense because the motivations throughout are different. And so it just made it a struggle to connect to the two. I don't think I have anything else nice to say about that book, so we're just going to move on. And while it seemed like this was going to be a great time to sit in front of my window and film, I'm realizing that it's now just the time where the sun is going to shine directly into my eyes. So there's that. Okay, the final work that I had is a work of contemporary lit, but it's also sort of on the speculative side of sci-fi or like time loopy side, that kind of thing. And that is The Husbands, written by Holly Gramazio. And this was published in 2024. This tells the story of Lauren, who is living a good life, a life that she is quite happy with. And after a night of partying and celebrating with her friends, she comes home to her husband, who welcomes her home as he opens the front door. Except Lauren doesn't have a husband. And so, needless to say, she's a bit confused as to what's going on. And what follows is her crazy, weird, unexpected adventure with a potentially magic attic where what goes up is not necessarily what comes down. And I'm talking about the husbands. The husbands go up, and not necessarily the same husband comes down. And this book does a really fascinating and pretty quirky, fun job of exploring relationships, marriage, dating apps, speed dating, love, and the difference between knowing what you want and how to find it and how to accept it and get it. And I thought that was really interesting and well done in this book. For me, the highs were definitely the plot, how well paced it was, and just how fun it was and how lighthearted it was for the vast majority of the book. There are some ridiculous things that kind of happen. You do get a little bit of a loop and a sort of predictable sequence of events because there is this continuous action of, husbands going up and down in the attic, if you will. And I think that brought in a little bit of the only low for me in this book, which was I also felt like this book was just a tad bit too long. I did feel like towards the end of the book that it maybe just needed to be resolved a little bit sooner. I can say that if you don't like time loops or you don't like plots that have some sort of looped action in them, the book might start to feel repetitive for you. I personally didn't find it repetitive, but I love a good time loop, especially if it's not a super long time loop. And this wasn't truly a time loop, it was like a loop of action, if you but different things were happening pretty much all the time throughout the book. And I think that kept it more interesting than it otherwise could have been or would have been. I think the only thing that I felt kind of like on the fence about was actually the resolution of the story, which is kind of understandable because even as the book started moving towards a resolution, I felt kind of stuck in both what I wanted to happen and what might be possible to happen at the end. And I thought that actually made it kind of interesting because I really felt like, did the author write herself into a story? Is she going to be able to resolve this story and this problem well? And I think she did. I enjoyed it. I gave this book 4 stars. I would recommend it to anybody who likes to explore alternative lives, or somebody trying to relive their same life in different ways. Well, it's not exactly that. It does remind me a bit of the book Life After Life, by Kate Atkinson, and a somewhere between that and The Midnight Library. So if you've read either of those books or just like that idea of somebody trying some similar aspect of their life over and over again, but not necessarily repeating the same life, I think this would be a good one. I think another book that this also reminds me of that I think is probably a tad more similar would also be 4321 by Paul Auster. It touches on bits of each of those 3 books, but not one perfectly. It's definitely its own thing. It does to me feel a bit more like soft sci-fi than contemporary lit, but I think because of sort of the light, fun nature of it, I think that's why it's marketed more as that. I would also say this kind of feels like a book that deals with romance, but doesn't necessarily get romantic, though there is a tad bit of spice in here, so do keep that in mind. But the romance in these relationships is definitely not the point and purpose of this book. So if you haven't read this book because you were thinking that it's a romance novel, I will tell you right now it's really not. And if you read it for that, you're probably going to be really frustrated and bored and unhappy with it, or at least potentially so. But I liked that book. I enjoyed 2 out of 3 of the books that I read this week pretty well. So that's not bad. I don't think that's bad. This one though was extremely disappointing. I can't say. I'm like I've had distance, so I can talk about it objectively without getting mad. But I was mad at the end of this book. I was mad at this book. I was so frustrated by things that happened in it. If you like Great Expectations, if you like Catherine Havisham, all I can think of is I looked up this one, I think a 1 star review on Goodreads, and the person said that I guess I didn't need to know Miss Havisham's backstory. Same, same. All right, that's it for me today. Hopefully, you had a great reading week, and I will talk to you next time.